Those who are new to my channel, I have a YouTube channel. Every sub helps tremendously. Trying to get to 500K by December, which is super ambitious. But I think we can do it. I think we can absolutely do it. And we have black against 1995, very strong player. Okay, we're facing d4, which we have not faced in quite a long time. I mean, I think we've only had one Grunfeld game thus far, and those watching on YouTube who might be aware of the Reddit discussion that was happening over the last couple of weeks, where, you know, some people are saying the Grunfeld is a great opening for intermediate players, others are on the opposite side of the boat. I'll address that in a little bit more depth after the game, but right now let's focus on the play and on the theory, because this is a serious opponent. Now, as you guys know, my recommendation for the speedrun is the Grunfeld, which is a risky recommendation, one that I vacillated on for a while, but I'm still happy with it. So as hopefully you know, the main move here is knight to c3, then bishop g7 leads to the King's Indian defense, and the move d5 initiates the Grunfeld. So those two openings are very much related. Knight f3 is, of course, also a possibility, and it's important not to play d5 here, right? If you play d5 prematurely, then white's going to trade and play e4, and the issue is that you won't be able to take the knight on c3 because there is no knight on c3. I'll spell that out after the game. So what you want to do here is first fianchetto the bishop. You have to wait for knight c3 and only then play the move d5 if you want to play the Grunfeld properly. You're not allowing the King's Indian here because white can't play e4, right? When white plays e4, you know that you've allowed the King's Indian because you can't play d5. Here, e4 simply leads to knight takes e4. So our opponent plays a rather strange variation, kind of developing the knight and then the bishop in an order that I'm not too familiar with. Now, one general piece of advice for openings is that when you learn an opening system, such as the Grunfeld, it's very important not to be dogmatic, right? People get into trouble when they try to play the same system regardless of what the opponent does. That's a recipe for failure because you have to be flexible enough to react appropriately when your opponent plays something weird. This is a little bit weird because he's delaying the development of the b1 knight. Developing it is very typical here. So I'm already kind of on guard, and I'm not just going to close my eyes and play the typical Grunfeld moves. I'm going to invest some thought into perhaps modifying my opening system, which could be appropriate given how our opponent is playing. So maybe a King's Indian setup is better in this particular version, and you don't necessarily have to know all of the King's Indian ideas to play it successfully, right? That's this concept of flexibility in the opening, which I think is one of the reasons I don't recommend the London system, because that teaches you that you can play the same moves against absolutely everything and get away with it, which you can with the London, but can't in other openings. So, TLDR. We're going to delay the move d5. I don't like d5 here because white can take and stick the bishop on e5, and we definitely don't want to trade our dark squared bishops early. So let's start with the most flexible possible move. I think that's the castle, right? We're just developing our pieces and forcing our opponent to put their cards on the table, so to speak. And then we'll decide whether we want to play a Grunfeld setup, or maybe even we want to play a Benoni type setup and stick the c-pawn forward, especially because I'm looking at the b2 pawn and I'm noticing that it's weak, so we might have some tactics related to a discovery on that pawn. So to me, c5 looks quite appealing. Our opponent, by the way, isn't really playing a pure London. A pure London would be the pawn on c3 rather than c4. So he's playing some sort of a cross between the London and the sort of main line, right? Which is generally not advisable, but there's nothing horribly wrong with how our opponent is handling this. Given the placement of the bishop on f4, I'm extremely tempted to play a King's Indian setup because the King's Indian setup against the bishop on f4 is incredibly effective. And there's a plan here that I really, really like, which involves starting with d6. Now, I'll play d6, and then people on YouTube will be saying, well, what do you mean? You're recommending the Grunfeld, and now you're reverting back to what I thought you would recommend. But again, this all goes back to the concept of flexibility. You have to be ready to play a different setup against, let's say, an unorthodox opening choice by your opponent. So I really like the move d6 here. We're going to play it, and then I'm going to show you a setup that I think gives black a very good position against the bishop f4 variation. Yeah, if you're a Grunfeld player, you have to be able to play a King's Indian setup. If you're a King's Indian player, sometimes pushing the pawn 2 squares is a much more effective way to play the opening. Now, the elevator pitch of the King's Indian is that you put the pawn on d6 in order to prepare e7, e5. In this particular version, this is hard to do, and that is why white puts the bishop on f4. White is making it extremely hard for black to prepare the e5 pawn break. So you might say, well, then let's play c5, but c5 isn't all that effective here because white can just ignore. c5 is a decent move. Here's the setup that I really like. We start with the move c6. If you've seen King's Indian games, you will know that this move is actually incredibly common because typically the knight from b8 is developed to d7. That's just how you do it in the King's Indian. So putting the pawn on c6 does not really obstruct the development. What does the move c6 accomplish? Well, you'll see what it accomplishes on the next move. We're preparing a plan of queenside expansion, which will also give our light squared bishop a nice developing square. But in and of itself, this move also controls some key central squares. It controls the d5 square. It grabs a little bit of space on the queen side. So it's just a sort of harmless way to improve the placement of your pieces and pawns. Hopefully, this is kind of making sense so far. This is a King's Indian setup as defined by the pawn being on d6 rather than d5, which would be the Grunfeld. And we played the move c6. So start thinking about what I could mean when I say queenside expansion. How do we prepare a plan of queenside expansion? What is the next move likely to be? I'm anticipating bishop e2 or bishop d3. So R.W. Zagar is recommending a plan that involves preparing e5. There's a tactical flaw involved in this plan, which I'll show you after the game. Yeah, so we're preparing b5. No, you definitely don't suck at chess, wing chess. You name the right plan. The plan is to play b5 and expand on the queen side. But you can't play b5 immediately because white has 3 defenders on that square. b5, cb, cb, bishop takes b5. And, you know, we can play that as a gambit, but there's no need for that. Let's play a6. There it is. a6, c6, and b5, which is a pretty ubiquitous plan in a lot of different openings, like these 3 particular moves, building up a pawn triangle on the queen side, but the general goal is queenside expansion, now with the ultimate aim of developing an attack of some sort on the queen side and making white more uncomfortable. So we're preparing b5. Grizzly Wolf asks, does this weaken the b6 square? Technically, it does. The b6 square is a weakness by definition because it can't be defended by a pawn. But let me ask you in return, how is white ever going to exploit that square? Right? White is never going to be able to put a piece on that square, especially after we play b5, because white's not going to have time to play queen b3 and knight a4 and then knight b6. It takes 3 moves for white to stick a knight on b6, and we could even bring our knight out to d7 at the right moment to really reinforce that square. Now, of course, you might be looking at this and saying, well, white is going to say over my dead body and play the move a4, which I'm kind of anticipating. Then there's the sort of secondary part of this plan. a4 creates a massive hole on the b4 square, which would be really nice as an outpost for our knight. Our opponent didn't play it, so I'll show you what to do after the game. Queen d2 is a little bit of a weird move. I'm not sure totally what our opponent is intending. Perhaps he's intending e4 and then bishop h6, but it's even more of a reason then to play the move b5 just in time. Let's go b5. We can play that without much thinking. If white plays e4, who can tell me how we will respond to that move? This is another benefit of playing on the flank, is you're making it harder for your opponent to play in the center. Yeah, e4, there is, of course, the move b4, dislodging the knight and winning a critical central pawn on e4. Yes, white will be able to take on b4, but that's a fair trade. That's a good trade for us. Center pawn for a corner pawn, or a flank pawn, rather. You might say, well, okay, so are we threatening the move b4? No, we don't necessarily want to rush the move b4 because it takes the pressure off of the c4 pawn. And it's not like the knight doesn't have any good squares. After b4, the knight gets stick on a4. The b4 pawn then becomes a weakness, and white gets closer to putting the knight on b6. So expansion doesn't mean that you sort of blindly move your pawns as far as they'll go. You can't win a game with a space advantage. You want to do it in a kind of measured way. Our opponent stops the move b4, so it's ultimately a moot point. Okay, now we need to work a little bit on developing the rest of our pieces. We have 2 pieces that are not developed. I mentioned when we were preparing the move b5 that a positive byproduct of this plan is that it gives this bishop a nice developing square. What am I talking about? Well, of course, I'm talking about the bishop fianchetto. And you might look at this and say, well, if we fianchetto the bishop is just kind of biting on granite. It's staring at its own pawn. But later in the game, we could prepare further expansion with c6, c5. Then the bishop potentially becomes a monster. And this is very standard in this line. So the other developing move that we should consider is knight b8 to d7. So we play bishop b7 and knight b to d7. And the benefit of knight b to d7 is that it does potentially prepare e5. Let's not throw that move into the garbage can. Under a different set of circumstances, e5 can still be very strong, but most likely we're going to orient ourselves to c5. We'll start with knight b d7, I think, because it prevents white from playing c5, as G-Dog points out. If bishop b7, white has this move c5, and then the bishop is genuinely blunted completely. But wait a second. I just saw something. No, I think I saw an interesting tactic. Let's go bishop b7. If white plays c5 here and tries to close our bishop down, we're going to take on c5, and then we're going to develop our knight to d7, attacking the c5 pawn. And who can tell me what tactic exists after white plays b4 in that position to solidify the pawn? And I see this because white's rooks are disconnected. Anytime the rooks are disconnected and you have an x-ray, you should be looking at this tactic. There was the move knight e4. Yeah, there was the move knight e4. And then we would have been able to take the rook in the corner. Again, that's a moot point now because white's castled. Now c5 becomes a genuine positional threat because it can be supported with b4, and then our bishop is genuinely going to be buried under the pile of rubble. And I'll show after the game, so don't worry too much if you're not able to visualize this. That's what the post-game analysis is for. Let's complete our development with the move knight b d7. I really don't see why not. And we've completed our development. We have a nice position. Our opponent has also handled things very decently. I actually think I had a better move, though. I'm bummed. I rushed it. There was a move here that went after the bishop pair, which some of you have suggested, knight h5, which I think we should have played in this position. But knight b d7 is also fine. Nothing wrong with that move. What's our mid-game plan for this setup? Well, it really depends almost entirely on what our opponent plays next, because our opponent, I think, has two main ways of approaching this. He can make these sort of general improving moves like rook a c1, or maybe rook f to d1. Then we will embark on one concept. But our opponent could also play this more aggressively and play a move like e4 and try to expand in the center. Our opponent could also discharge the tension with c takes b5. Then we would have to decide which pawn to recapture with. So I'm not thinking too much right now about what our next move is going to be. We're just kind of waiting for our opponent to reveal what his plan is. So this is a misconception that, when your opponent is thinking, you have to know what you're going to play next. You have to have a clear plan in mind. BS. In many positions, your plan depends entirely on what your opponent does, and you should spend your opponent's turn just sort of making general observations that could help you accelerate the process of looking for a move. So what sorts of observations are we making? Well, I'm noticing that the bishop on b7 can be cleared up with the move c5. The diagonal can be open, so that's something that we should keep in mind. Now, c5 does blunder the b5 pawn, but we could potentially take the pawn on c4 and then follow up with c5. This is a very typical idea when you've got this setup. I'm also keeping an eye on the possibility of e5. The queen on d2 and the queen on d8 are in a standoff, so there could be certain situations where e5 is possible even though there are more defenders on that square than there are attackers from black side, because maybe the queen on d2 becomes loose in some line. So I'm making that mental note to myself. Of course, we could also play rook e8 in order to prepare e5. Our opponent makes a general waiting move, h3. Okay. So the way that I see it, we have two approaches. We can continue playing the waiting game with a move like rook e8, potentially preparing e5. But I pointed out that preparing c5 is more in the spirit of this position, and that's what we're going to go for. So again, if we play the immediate c5, we blunder the pawn on b5. Everybody should see that. White has 3 attackers, and we would only have 1 pawn defending. So before playing c5, we need to discharge the tension with bc. And you might look at this and say, well, don't you leave the a6 pawn isolated? Isn't this pawn now a big weakness? Can't argue with that. It is a weakness. It's isolated, but it's not the most important pawn in the world, and it's very hard for white to attack. This is what I think a lot of people miss when they think about weaknesses. They think, okay, a weakness is bad. Yes, but you also have to ask yourself, how easy or hard is it for your opponent to actually attack that weakness? The pawn is defended nicely by the bishop and the rook. White can't attack it even if he tried. And even if we lose that pawn, it's really not the end of the world. So weakening a corner pawn is rarely a reason not to do something. There must be other drawbacks for you to be dissuaded from playing that line. So what does the move c5 do? Well, it opens up the bishop. why is that important? We're already threatening to take the knight on f3 and permanently cripple white's pawn structure. That's a huge positional threat. d5 is correct. Our opponent closes down the center, leading to a sort of Benoni structure, which is defined by the pawn on c5 and white's pawn on d5. This is a type of structure which arises very frequently from the modern Benoni. I'll show how that happens after the game. We can't waste time here, because if we give white a couple of tempi, what is white going to do? Well, white's going to play e4 and expand in the center. White will be having the positional threat of bishop h6. We've already talked about the importance of maintaining our dark squared bishop here. That's the soul of our position. Plus, the bishop on b7 is like, hey, what are you doing to me? Now I'm staring at this pawn. But this pawn on d5 is also a target, and we can use that pawn to assemble our pieces nicely on the queen side, I think. There's an obvious move in this position that I think we should flick in because it doesn't do any harm. Yeah, I'm talking about knight b6. Let's hit the bishop. Let's increase and intensify the pressure on the d5 pawn, and let's force this bishop to commit to a bad square such as a2, where it's really not doing anything other than defending this pawn. There's certain moves that you could really play without knowing what your follow-up is, because clearly this move doesn't do any harm. So right now we're making it one move at a time. We're waiting for our opponent's response, and then we're calibrating our subsequent play based on what our opponent does. Yeah, well, it would be nice if we could play e6, which is common in the Benoni. We can't do that. If we play e6, we blunder the pawn, and you could say, oh, but then we can take on f3, but you're going to end up giving two of your pawns away. That's not a worthy price to pay, because white's king is still pretty safe, even if white has to play gf. So e6 I really don't like. Also, it weakens the d6 pawn, as Akila points out. Okay, so if you play the Benoni, and I'm sure at least one person in the chat plays the modern Benoni, the move that I kind of want to play here, and I have two ideas, so I actually will need to think a little bit. One move that I want to play is incredibly typical in the Benoni, and that's the move c4, slicing off the connection between the bishop and the pawn and vacating the c5 square, which we can use as an outpost. Actually, for the f6 knight, we could play c4 and then knight fd7 and knight c5, putting pressure on various weak squares in white's position. So I really like the look of c4. Let's go for it. Again, a low-risk move. We push the pawn, we blunt the bishop, we attack d5, and we force white to play e4. Without the move e4, white's pawn would have been lost. White has no other way to defend d5. Falk asks, can't white play b4 here? I mean, b4 is not a dangerous move. It opens up the diagonal and it blunders the pawn on d5. But we're not afraid of b4. Now, white has to play e4. Our opponent is taking a while here. Not really sure what... Okay, e4, exactly. Yes. So now e6 is a more appealing move, but it's still bad because the d6 pawn becomes a serious weakness. As a result, in fact, we would lose that pawn. e6, de. We could go for some tactics there with knight takes e4, but I'm pretty skeptical about that because we are going to lose the d6 pawn pretty quickly after that. Although it has to be calculated, it's actually not totally clear-cut that e6 is a terrible move here. So what is white's positional threat in this situation? Once white plays e4, a positional threat has been created, which we cannot prevent, but we can take the sting out of it, and hopefully some of you know this technique. The threat is bishop h6. Why is that a threat? Well, that forces the exchange of bishops. Why does it force the exchange of bishops? Because the only way to keep the bishops alive is to duck with bishop h8, but then we would be losing the exchange. So how do we take the sting out of the move bishop h6? Well, we need to move the rook first so that bishop h6 could be met with bishop h8. This is a very, very standard technique that is applied oftentimes in the dragon and in other openings where you fianchetto the bishop and where you have to keep that bishop. The health of your position depends on your ability to keep that bishop alive. Now, our next few moves are probably going to be knight fd7 and then knight c5, and we're going to try to start accumulating the pressure on white's center, and eventually I think the light square bishop can be reignited if we're able to play the move e6. Queen e2. Okay. So, obviously our opponent hits the pawn on c4. That's fine. That's not such a big deal. In fact, I would even consider sacrificing that pawn in order to generate and get the bishop pair. We have a couple of ways to defend that pawn. The move that I really like here is actually a5. I really like the look of a5. What does a5 accomplish? Who can tell me what that move accomplishes? It grabs a little bit of space on the queen side, but how does it prevent bishop takes c4? Very nice. Very nice. So A5, bishop takes c4, knight takes c4, queen takes c4. We have bishop a6 at the end of the line, skewering the f1 rook and the queen on c4. Of course, white can block with knight b5, but then the e4 pawn is going to be lost. Are there alternatives to that move? Well, we could again consider the move e6. E6 might actually be an even better move in this position. Now, what is it about e6 that I like? Well, why was e6 bad previously? It was bad because the d6 pawn would have been lost. Here, the queen has moved away from d2, so e6 is a lot more appealing. So let me calculate this for a moment. e6, pawn takes, rook takes. White has knight g5. We bring the rook back. Bishop takes c4, d5. Man, that looks so much fun. You know what? We're playing in the spirit of the Benoni, and that's an aggressive opening, an opening in which opening up the center favors the side with the more active pieces. What I love about the move e6 is also that it opens up the light squared bishop, and eventually we want to do that anyway, so I don't see a reason for us to wait. The x-ray that the rook exerts on the queen is yet another reason to play e6 specifically here. Okay, our opponent takes immediately, and so we respond. Now, is this risky? Absolutely. This is a risky strategy for black. But look at how our pieces are breathing now. The bishop, the knight, the rook attack e4. Our dark squared bishop is intact and safe. Our pawns weak. Yes, they're extremely weak. That is the biggest flaw of our position. So what that means is we have to conduct the initiative carefully. The more pieces get traded, the more white repels our initiative, the likelier it is that our active pieces are canceled out by are incredibly weak pawns. But bishop takes c4, I think, is a mistake. How should we respond? Should we play knight takes c4? Well, no, because the rook is hanging. So should we meekly move the rook away? No, we have a better move. Why did we put the knight on b6? Well, we were defending the c4 pawn. We, of course, take the bishop, and we do it without too much thought. And then we play knight takes c4. Again, playing quickly because there's nothing to calculate here. 1, 2 defenders, 1, 2 attackers. Look at our bishops and how they're crisscrossing the board. The bishop on f4 can also get in trouble. If white plays knight takes knight, we respond with rook takes knight, forking the queen and the bishop. Now, technically, the queen could drop back to c1 in that position if you're able to visualize and protect the bishop, but then we could bring the other rook into the game, and the queen could get into b6. And this is why openings like the Benoni and the Grunfeld are so much fun, because you learn proper piece coordination, and you really begin to appreciate the value of having active pieces, which sounds like a meaningless cliche, but that's incredibly important as a beginner and early intermediate. Zassaz says, why not take with the bishop? Well, because the bishop is a treasure. It's a treasure because it attacks the knight on f3, and in general, having the bishop pair in an open board is good. So we don't want to give away that bishop for free. Bishop takes c4, white would take with a knight, or white would even have knight g5, forking the rook and the bishop. That would be an even bigger reason not to take with the bishop here. Knight to d4. Okay, that's a good move. It's a really good move, but nothing that we can't deal with. So what does this move do? Well, it attacks the queen. It attacks the rook. We cannot play a move like rook c8 here because white takes the rook anyway, simultaneously hitting the queen. So we do need to move the rook. Bishop takes d4, we're not even talking about because there's no way that I'm giving this bishop away without a fight. Where should we go with our rook? Well, we should just move it back to e8. Why not to e7? Because that walks into various tempo moves like knight d5 and knight c6. And we also want to open up the diagonal, keep that diagonal open for our queen. So I don't see a reason for us not to bring the rook back to e8. d5 didn't work. d5, knight takes c6. Same reason that rook c8 didn't work. That's why I pointed out that line. d5, knight takes rook, and that simultaneously hits the queen. So then dc, knight takes d8, and at the end, you're going to be down in exchange. So when you're considering a threat on your piece, don't just say, oh, he's attacking the rook so I can counterattack their queen. You also have to understand what happens after the rook is captured. Does that create any additional threats? Does it attack your queen? In this case, it does, so you know that counterattacking your opponent's queen isn't a good idea. Knight d5. I was a little bit worried about this move, but now that I look at it a little bit closer, I think it might be losing the game. Now, what is the first thing that I see when I look at the move knight d5? Well, what I see is that both of our bishops are making contact with both of our opponent's knights. This is a situation that I have talked about before. It's a situation that makes it very likely that we can make a move that will separate one of our opponent's defenders from their pieces, because the queen is defending both of the knights. So logically, what type of move are we looking for? Well, perhaps a move that attacks the queen, because perhaps the queen will not be able to move to a square where it can defend both knights at the same time. Mathematically, there is no such square in existence. Well, there's c5, but it's controlled. So even without calculation, you should be able to come up with rook c8 on the basis of your intuition alone. Now, the line doesn't end here. The queen can move to a square such that it attacks one of our minor pieces. Now, the knight is protected by the rook, so queen e2 is not effective. Queen d3 blunders the knight on d5. Queen a2 blunders the knight on d4. But there is the tricky move queen b3. What does queen b3 accomplish? Well, it hits the bishop on b7. So you might say, okay, well, queen b3, let's take one knight and then let's take the other knight, but queen takes bishop defends the other knight. But don't stop calculating there. Queen b3, bishop takes knight, queen takes knight. We have a winning move. We actually have a winning move in this position as well. I think there are two ways to win a piece. But even simpler is bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, and rook c5 to hit the queen. It's not a queen trap. The queen can drop back to a2. It can drop to b7. Doesn't matter because the knight on d4 is going to be lost. Now you might say, well, what about bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, rook c5, knight d4 to c6? Well, then we just take white's queen. Because once white takes our queen, we just recapture the knight. And in either case, we're up a minor piece. So just double checking. Yeah, I think we can take. So we give up our light squared bishop, but we do it for the greater good. And rook c5 wins the knight. That's it. That's why the queen is the worst defender. Something I've been saying since the start of the speedrun. It's what's behind the rule, which states that you should do things with a piece of lower value. The lower value the piece, the better it is as a defender. It didn't matter, though. I mean, white was losing anyway. Yeah, queen takes c6 is... At least it keeps the knight alive, right? At least our opponent defended the knight. GG. But that's not disappointing because the game was over anyway. We were winning a full minor piece. There's a lot to talk about. That was 24 moves, but there is a lot to unpack here. And we're going to do a little bit of opening analysis because I will admit I'm not too familiar with how our opponent handled the opening. I've never faced that before. So we're going to see if I was right to transition us into a King's Indian position or whether it was possible to still stick with the Grunfeld. Okay, so d4, knight f6, c4, g6. Previously, we faced sort of fianchetto structure, a game that I still haven't analyzed, but I will still put that out. Knight f3. So as I indicated, after knight c3, the Grunfeld is d5. After c takes d5, knight takes d5, white generally occupies the center. And it's very important that black has the move knight takes knight, which affords black a tempo that is used to fianchetto the bishop. And then we play c5, and we chip away at white's center. This is the mainline Grunfeld, and I'm sure that we're going to get the mainline Grunfeld in subsequent games. So I won't talk about the theory here right now. Let's focus instead on what our opponent did. So first things first, why is d5 a bad move here? It's because after cd, well, queen takes d5 is just crap because you walk right into knight c3. Knight takes d5, white plays e4, and knight takes knight. No, wait a second. There's no knight takes knight. So our knight has to slink back to a very passive square such as b6, and white just gets excellent development. White gets a tempo to prevent bishop g4. And what you will find is that in a position like this, the standard Grunfeld move, c5, is terrible because white just takes the pawn and hits the knight. You should be able to see that this is not the same as c5 with the white pawn on c3. Can you speak as why not knight f6? Well, knight f6, knight c3. And again, after bishop g7, your pieces are stumbling on each other. This bishop is just staring at the knight, and white's center is left completely intact. It's unattackable. Yeah, also e5 with tempo is annoying. So that is why here you play bishop g7. If the moment white plays knight c3, to play the Grunfeld, you go d5. And again, if white takes it and plays e4, then you're able to play knight takes c3 and c5. And again, we transpose to the mainline Grunfeld. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, you might say, well, why do we need to rush with d5? I play castles. That's my main move. But after e4, you get into the main line of the King's Indian defense, which is characterized by pawns on e4, d4, and c4. A little side note, a lot of people get confused between the Pirts, or the Perk, and the King's Indian defense. There's one big difference. In the Pirts, the pawn is on c2. In the King's Indian, the pawn is on c4. That literally is it, right? The Pirts is like the King's Indian against one e4. So it's like playing the King's Indian, but there's a big difference. Here, the pawn is on c2. Here, the pawn is on c4. You can see otherwise the position is exactly the same, I guess, after knight f3, bishop g7. But this ostensibly small difference actually makes a huge impact on the development of the position. That's why the Pirc is a much worse opening objectively, I think, than the King's Indian. The main reason is that with the pawn still on c2, white's queenside is intact, which means that a lot of lines in the Pirc involve white castling queenside, just like in the Sicilian. For instance, bishop e3, castles queen d2, followed by queenside castle, is one of the most dangerous weapons against the Pirc. Hopefully you can understand that with a pawn already on c4, the queenside is a much less safe place for white's king, so that basically eliminates a whole host of possible responses. Also, the light squared bishop finds it harder in the King's Indian to develop to an active square. Here, the bishop can be developed to c4. Okay. Also, there's the Austrian attack, which is similar to the four pawns attack. In the Austrian attack, white plays f4, one of the most dangerous systems against the Pirc. Meanwhile, the four pawns attack against the King's Indian, which is knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, f4, is a dangerous line, but it's not as dangerous as the Austrian attack, because here, white overextends his center. White has four pawns in the center, hence the four-pawn attack, but black has very effective ways to chip away at that center with c5 and e5. So anyways, I could talk about this forever. Let's focus on the game. Knight f3, bishop g7, and our opponent plays this odd move, bishop f4, kind of some sort of weird London-y type setup. I'm going to check the engine here to see what Mr. Stockfish likes us to do, which is always a good idea when you face an unfamiliar opening. Okay, so I had a suspicion that this was the best move. The engine does approve of castles and d6. The move d5 here might seem very tempting because after c takes d5, knight takes d5, you hit the bishop with tempo. But who can remind me why this is actually a lot less effective than it appears? The engine confirms this. White is slightly better in this position. What does white do? No, not bishop g5. Bishop g5 is innocuous. Bishop not e3. Not e3, because then we get the bishop pair and c5 wins a pawn because white can't take due to bishop takes b2. It's bishop e5. No, guys, g3, e3, that just gives up the bishop pair and black is doing well. Bishop e5 is the reason this is annoying. So always remember, you shouldn't give away your Grunfeld or King's Indian bishop without a proper reason to do so. Here, it's very hard to avoid the trade. Trading and white is simply better because what are you going to attack white's center with? Now, yeah, you can play knight f6, but you've wasted a tempo. You've played knight takes d5, back to f6. You've given white tempo for development, and black is slightly worse here. In the Grunfeld, you don't want your knight to be on f6. You want the bishop to have a direct line of fire to the d4 pawn. Okay? So that is why I decided on a more flexible approach, which is to castle, delaying the movement of the d-pawn, waiting for white to put their cards on the table. But the engine actually likes the immediate c5. This is the engine's preferred move. And I pointed this out during the game. c5 is very good because the b2 pawn is unprotected. And after d5, the engine actually proposes a Benko Gambit style idea. Who can tell me what move that implies? When I say a Benko Gambit style idea, if you know what the Benko Gambit is, you'll know what move to play here. Yeah, b5. Sacrificing the pawn in order to separate white's pawn chain, but more importantly, open up the queen side. And how do you follow up the move b5? After c takes b5, who can tell me what the typical follow-up is? It's a6, yeah. Yeah, it's a6, right? So now you're trying to get rid of the b pawn. Why are you trying to get rid of it? So that the queen can develop to b6 and have a direct line of fire to the b2 pawn. The classic Benko Gambit is to play c5, which is the entrance to the modern Benoni. While we're at it, let me show you what the Benoni is. The Benoni is the move e6 here. And hopefully you're able to see the similarity between this structure and the structure that we had in the game. So in the game, look at the similarity. It's exactly the modern Benoni structure with a pawn on t5. Here, it's the same structure. White plays e4 and life goes on. This is a very theoretical opening. I won't delve into it. But the Benko Gambit is the immediate b5. C takes b5 and a6, named after Pal Benko, Hungarian Grandmaster, who recently passed away. He was US champion. And this is still a very reputable opening. White is better with best play, but if you want an aggressive line against d4, you should absolutely consider the Benko Gambit. So in any case, if we compare this version to the version in this position, this is an improved version for black because we've already fianchettoed our bishop, and the bishop on f4 is incredibly awkward. It's neither here nor there, and the b2 pawn is even more vulnerable. So how is the game likely to continue? Well, b takes a6 is likely, and now the engine gives the immediate queen b6 because the a6 pawn is not going anywhere. We don't need to recapture it immediately, and guess what? White has a very hard time to defend the b2 pawn. If white plays b3, this is already winning. How is it winning? Well, there's knight takes d5. Oh, and this is brilliant. Oh my gosh, this is an amazing line. Okay, watch this. So knight takes d5 should make sense to everybody, right? But here's the catch. After queen takes d5, it looks like black has blundered. Because if we take the rook, white takes our rook, and you can't trap the queen here. You don't have bishop b7. You're actually losing another minor piece. But there is a ridiculous computer move in this position, which wins the game for black. I'll give people a chance to find it. It's really hard. I didn't see it at all. I mean, once it's played, you understand the reason. Yeah, in Russia, the Benko is also called the Volga Gambit. It's not queen a5 check because that doesn't do anything. What does queen a5 accomplish? Still, if you take the rook, white takes the rook. It doesn't defend the rook. It's not knight c6, although you're very close. Knight c6 is good, but here white can intercept with knight e5, and the position is unclear. But you have the right square. It's queen c6. People are getting it. Very nice. It's queen c6. It's not rook takes a6, because, again, white can intercept the bishop. It's queen to c6. This is a double attack. You're attacking the queen and you're attacking the rook. What is the purpose of that move? Bishop b7, Frankfurt Airport blunders the bishop. Don't forget about the pawn on a6. White has to trade queens, because if white moves the queen, then we take the rook. So after queen c6, we play knight takes c6. And look at what the knight on c6 does. It prevents white from sticking a knight on e5. So the rook is now trapped. If you say, oh, let's give up a knight to avoid losing the rook, you're actually going to lose the knight and lose the rook. If you say, okay, let's give up a knight like this, black plays knight takes e5, and white cannot prevent the further discovery of knight d3 or even knight back to c6. You have to move your knight. If you move it to c3, bang, that's a fork. White has to take, and another fork on the rook. Queen c6 is ridiculous. That's a GM level move, but hopefully you're able to understand the point of that move. So obviously b3 is not forced, and you might say, well, what about queen b3? Right, offering the exchange of queens. Well, here you play rook takes a6, another sexy move. And you say, I'm happy to trade queens, but first of all, I'm going to recapture your pawn. And this position is horrible for white because white is collapsing. White's losing a ton of pawns here. d5 is hanging, b2 is hanging, and the bishop is going to be a monster. And if white takes the knight on b8, x-ray defending the bishop, then of course black has queen takes b3, and the rook is lost in the end. So these are dangerous lines, which shows you how strong the Benko gambit can be. White just doesn't have a good way of defending the b2 pawn. The engine's move here is knight to c3, which I don't think a human would play. And after queen takes b2, apparently knight a4 equalizes, but this still looks like a nasty position for white. I would play this any day of the week with black. I don't see any other good ways to defend b2. If you play queen c2, you drop this pawn, which is not a pawn you can afford to lose. Queen d2 walks into knight e4, and again, you have queen takes b2 next. So this is actually the best way to play. You stick c5 in, and then you transition to a Benko gambit style treatment. Of course, white can play e3 and keep the pawn on d4, but I think cd4, ed4, and d5 is a very nice way to handle this position, because if white takes it, you get a beautiful isolated queen pawn structure where you have control of the square in front of the IQP, which, as we know, is almost always a good thing. So c5 is going to be my official recommendation. Why didn't I do it? Because I'm too obsessed with the King's Indian, and I kind of wanted to show the idea with d6, c6, a6, and b5, just to add to people's collection of knowledge about this position. And I'll be honest, I didn't fully appreciate the power of the move b5. I saw this idea out of the corner of my eye, but I wasn't sure how much of an improved version this is over the regular Benko gambit, and well, you know what the answer is now. Much improved. But it's not unheard of for me to play a Benko gambit style idea. I remember a King's Indian game that I had some years ago where I won exactly in this fashion. I transitioned to a Benko gambit style approach, and I mean, I crushed the guy because it was such an improved version. Here's the game. This is from World Youth 2013, under 18. My opponent was a pretty strong player. So this started out as a Samish King's Indian with f3. And I developed a system where the knight from f6 goes back to open up the diagonal. You play c5. Now my opponent makes a mistake. He castles, allowing my knight to get out and allowing me to secure the bishop pair, which I do. But first, I decided to play what move? If you guys have been paying attention, this move should be very natural, especially because without the light squared bishop, our light squared bishop has incredible prospects if you can get it on a6. The move is b5. White has to play cb. Now we snap off the bishop, and we take back on b5. My opponent takes back, and you should know what the next move is. It's bishop a6. Get the bishop out to the uncontested diagonal, hit the knight. My opponent drops it back. Notice that a4 doesn't actually help because you can pile up the pressure on the knight in a million different ways. You go queen b6. Okay, so that's not scary. My opponent goes back. Here comes the queen. Here comes the rook. Just look at the pressure that my pieces are exerting, all of them. Rook fd1. Now bishop takes knight, which is a tactical move. Positionally, it doesn't make sense, but tactically it does. Who can spot the subsequent maneuver which causes white's position to collapse? Why are we taking that knight? Which piece can jump into the game now? And where does it go? What's the final destination for it? It's not e5. You don't want to close up the diagonal. It's knight e5. Oh yeah, I guess that's what you meant. Knight to c4 is a fork on the bishop and the pawn. So the bishop has to go back. And now calm move, queen b4, threatening to take on b2. If white defends, then simply bishop takes knight. That's the problem with having uncoordinated rooks, is this is always going to lose. That's it. My opponent went a3, and I stick the queen right in that weak square. And even in the endgame, white collapses because he's going to lose b2. And once he loses b2, my c-pawn is going to decide the game because it's a passed pawn. Rook a b8. Finally, I take the pawn. The smoke clears. I stop white's pawn, and I just start pushing the c-pawn. The game is over. c4, c3, c2. But the final detail after knight b4, rook takes a4. This is critical. If white takes the pawn, the rook swings over to c4, and the knight is lost because this is a perpetual pin, and just bishop b2 dislodges the rook. So my opponent went knight t3. I trade rooks, and what's the final move of the game? It's obviously bishop b2, because if the knight takes, then black promotes. Otherwise, we promote and win full piece. So my opponent resigned here. So, simple illustration of how powerful Benko-style ideas can be. Yeah, this was a very satisfying game. So anyways, let's go back to the game. We've spent a lot of time on the opening. Let's move to the middle game. But hopefully this has been relatively illuminating. So we decided to play a King's Indian setup. So again, why didn't I play d5? Well, again, it's because of this bishop e5 move, which I felt justifies the placement of the bishop on f4. I don't want to trade dark squared bishops. Even if the computer says this is equal after knight f6, I felt like it wasn't really in the spirit of what I'm trying to do. So we played a King's Indian setup. Our opponent plays e3. We played c6. Yeah, bishop f4, castles, e3, d6, knight c3, c6. And white plays bishop e2. Not much to say about the way that our opponent is playing this setup. And of course, a6 is the crux of our idea. So who can tell me what we would have done in response to a4? This is very important because most people, I think, would play a4. And you can't play b5. There are too many defenders on the square. The rook is undefended. So how do we exploit the hole on b4? Yeah, we play a5. We push the pawn twice, and then we play knight a6 and knight b4. And black is a great position. Knight a6, let's say h3. We stick the knight on this beautiful outpost. And then subsequently, our plan can be, for example, to prepare e5. How do we prepare e5 efficiently? Well, one way is to move the knight back to d7, much like I did in that game. This prepares e5 straight away because now you have two additional defenders on that square. Black has a perfectly good position. Black has a great King's Indian position, which you can largely play without knowing what the ideas are. You can play e5 and then deploy the queen to e7. Eventually, you're going to solve the problem of your light squared bishop. Big Sus asks, why not queen b6? Well, that's just a one-move threat, which doesn't do much. It threatens the pawn, yes, but here white can defend with something like queen d2, and you've sort of committed the placement of your queen. You want your queen in the center because you want it to be able to support both sides of the board, right? Be very careful, very wary of one-move-itis, which is a big enemy in these types of positions. I don't like c5 because it creates an equivalent hole on b5. Remember, that's why we played c6 to defend the b5 square. This just gives white an equivalent outpost. You know, why would you want to do that? Also, white can close up the center with d5. And with the bishop on f4, it's very, very hard for us to open the center because the d6 pawn is always going to be weak. So hopefully that makes sense from a general standpoint. White played queen d2. Okay. We play b5. So again, if white plays e4, we obviously play b4 and hit the knight and win the pawn. I think white is slightly better here, according to the engine. So that's true, but the engine doesn't really appreciate King's Indian positions. No, actually, black is doing great after b5. I just checked. But after a3, I think I made a small mistake. I feel like this would have been a great time for us to collect the bishop pair. And if you play the London system, which is unfortunate, sorry, I had to refresh because it disconnected me. If you play the London system, you should know what this move is. Now, in the London system, why does white play h3 early? What is the purpose of this move? What is it that you are taking the sting out of? And our opponent did this move, making it too late for us to initiate what I wanted to do. And so we played bishop b7. What was a suitable alternative here? And it is the top engine move I just checked. Knight h5, exactly. You go after the bishop. The bishop can move to g5. But now we chase the bishop away. h6, bishop h4, and g5. Very important note. Knight takes g5, you might say, oh, it opens up a discovery on the bishop. But no, you take back, and again, you're attacking h4. And the knight can just drop back to f6. Insufficient compensation for the piece. Bishop g5 doesn't do anything. We just drop our knight back. So white has to go back to g3. Now, importantly, you don't have to rush knight takes g3. Where is this bishop going? It's not going anywhere. You can just let it sit on g3. Now, the moment white plays h3, then it's a good time to take the bishop. But the engine likes bishop f5. Actually, it wants to develop the bishop to a different square, which is kind of interesting. And then eventually, you take the bishop on g3 when the time comes for that. Yeah, bishop f5, for example, castles, bc, bishop c4, and again, knight d7 to prepare c5. But I love this position with the bishop pair because the dark-squared bishop is going to be uncontested. So I think knight h5 is a move that you should very often consider and occurs frequently in London system type positions. Hopefully that makes sense. Now you might say, well, okay, but as Aquila says, a lot of people are put off by this because you're weakening your kingside. And you are weakening your kingside. There's no doubt about that. I can probably show you some games where black does something like this and then gets checkmated. Those games happen very often, but remember that white is probably going to castle kingside here. White can't really castle queenside because look at the state of the queenside. We've got the pawn here. We want white to castle queenside. We're going to checkmate him. And white, when he castles kingside, essentially relinquishes the ability to exploit the weak pawns. Now you could say, well, could white stay in the center? Well, if white stays in the center, then the rooks are disconnected. And how do you propose that white exploits this weakness? It's much easier said than done because knight takes g5 never really works. White can't get a queen to h7, and even if he could, the bishop defends that square. The other bishop defends h8. So don't worry about these positions. Just because the h file is open doesn't mean that it's automatically checkmate. You have to think concretely, okay, how can our opponent actually exploit the weakness of the king? So for instance, if we take this position, let's say white plays e4 and chases the bishop away, then takes on g5. Even if I gave you 3 moves, you couldn't checkmate me. Even if you put your queen on h4, these 2 mating squares are very safely protected. But what would I do here with black? I would play e5, opening up a channel between the queens. Either white has to trade queens or his center collapses entirely. So as you get to a more advanced level, 1800, you have to start thinking more concretely about the ramifications of your moves. And you shouldn't rule something out just because it has a drawback. Because at this level, things get more complex. At a lower level, games are decided by global blunder, right? And you can largely play moves that don't contain any drawbacks. At this higher level, you can't win a game. You can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. So you have to start developing a concrete ability to compare the pros and cons of each move, which is incredibly hard. I wanted to show 2 other things before we move on. 2 very instructive games. First, I wanted to do a search and to see if I could show you on the fly a game in which black did this and then lost, can't crash and burn, to show you that, yes, these moves contain their drawbacks and sometimes it's too much. But just give me a second. Here's a game from 1995. Nader Hanov is a GM. And this is a very similar position to what we just had. Guess what he plays? Well, he plays g5 and knight h5. Now, obviously, the problem with this move isn't that black gets checkmated. White's already castled kingside. Who can tell me the blunder that black has just committed? It's not like the biggest blunder in the world, but it lost him the game ultimately. What's the problem with knight h5 here? And don't just say knight takes g5, because, okay, knight g5, knight g3 is what he was relying on, but what detail did he overlook? What detail did black overlook? No, not knight takes f7. Knight f7, you can actually even take the bishop with check. And black is up 2 minor pieces. It's not knight takes f7. It's f takes g3. It's f takes g3, which taking away from the center is a move that's often missed. And look at the bishop on f5. It's hanging, so black not only loses a pawn, but his entire king side is also shattered. So f takes g3 is what black missed, and white won the game, as you can see by the 1-0. Okay, so that's one example. Let me see if I can quickly find another where black, in fact, gets checkmated. Okay, here's one where black eventually... Oh, this is a sick game, actually. Just a moment. Just a moment, setting it up. Yeah, I can see the same blunder being committed very, very frequently with f takes g3. Okay, this is super nice. This is super, super nice. And I'm not totally sure that this was sound. So very similar position. Just a second. Very similar position. And then I'll show the third game that I wanted to illustrate an important concept. Okay, here we go. This is not a well-known game. I don't know these players, but it doesn't matter. The concepts are more important. So in this position, black plays knight h5, okay? And obviously, as you know, white plays knight takes g5, black plays knight takes g3, and black does not have a bishop on f5. The problem here is this intermediate move, bishop h7 check. This is a brilliant move. King h8, take the knight. Notice that white takes with the f-pawn anyway to open up the rook. Now the bishop drops back. What's the problem? The problem is that white threatens mate in 2, and I'm sure that black was relying on the move knight f6, but simply rook takes f6, and the game is over. Queen h5, and queen g7 is checkmate. And queen h7, that is. So instead, black plays bishop h6 to open up a running square for the king. But white brings the knight into the attack, and then the queen into the attack. And white finds a sexy crushing move in this position. Who can spot it? I don't even think it's the best move. I think white had a move here that won immediately, but the concept was correct. Yeah, well, knight takes d6 is what white plays. I think knight takes g5 is even stronger. White played knight takes d6. Same concept everywhere. If black takes, then you obviously just get checkmated. But knight g5 also threatens a fork on e6. So black just can't. It's overwhelming. After knight d6, black could stave off defeat for a couple more moves. But as you can tell, I mean, it just gets totally demolished. Completely and totally demolished. Yeah, wow. This is really nice. Rook f7 at the end. And it's unstoppable checkmate. So anyways, again, everything has to be taken very concretely. Last detour game, and then we'll finally move on to the middle game. I know this is pretty extensive, but these positions are hard to really describe without a lot of examples because, you know, they're very dependent on concrete phenomena in the position. This is a game that I played against Alex Yermolinsky, who's a GM. Hopefully a lot of people have heard of him. Impression of Yermolinsky. Very nice, very nice. Yermolinsky and I played game. I was 2300. Yermolinsky was 2600. This was not Tulsa. This was Vegas, I think. That's wrong. But the year is correct. This was 2008. Here's what happens. We have a King's Indian. And Yermolinsky plays the system with h3 and bishop g5, which is still pretty popular. And I decided, hey, I was like in love with the idea that I executed in the game. So I played c6, a6, and b5. This was a book recommendation. Alex castles, and here I make a tremendous mistake, which is a mistake that I talked about during the game. What do people think I played? And we discussed this move during our speedrun game. I mentioned that it was wrong, and this is how I learned that lesson. Oh, h6 is good. h6 is best. I would play h6 now. I played the premature b4. And here's what I allowed. Watch what happens. Knight sticks itself on a4. Knights on the rim are amazing. I played knight fd7, trying to prepare the move c5, and then everything would be groovy. How does Yermolinsky stop all of my ideas and just bury me under a pile of rubble on the queen side? What does he do? Bang, c5. White plays c5. This pawn is unattackable. You can't attack it. You have nothing to attack it with. Queen a5, blunders e7, and the bishop parks on d6. Look at black's position. Everything is buried. a5, he goes rook c1, typical Soviet move to reinforce this golden pawn. Bang, bang, bang. I mean, he just like crushes me here. My whole position is just totally collapsing. And I went on for 50 moves. I sacked the exchange to try to I had a good knight on d5, but it's obviously totally insufficient compensation. And eventually Alex, he put his knight on b6 and he won pretty easily here. So it's important not to push b4 unless you have a very good reason to do so. That's how I learned that particular lesson. I didn't play knight h5. So in the game, we focused instead on queenside development, which is, of course, I think totally fine as well. So bishop b7. Our opponent castles, knight bd7, h3. Still knight h5 was good, but we played without it. bc, bishop c4, and c5. So hopefully this idea makes sense. But after d5, I think black is worse objectively. I think practically black's position has a lot of life. But I think there's no question if you turn on the engine, which I won't do, it will give a significant advantage to white. But I don't care. It gives white an almost winning advantage in the Benoni. The Benoni has survived for 50 years and has caused anguish to a lot of top players. Because from a practical perspective, black's play is very easy. So here we play rook e8. Super important not to allow bishop h6. File this away in your mental Rolodex of ideas. If you're trying to preserve your bishop, then you want to move the rook away so that bishop h6 can be met with bishop h8. Sometimes this bishop is so worth it that you sacrifice the exchange on f8, but there's no reason to do that here because you have time for rook e1. So queen e2, I already think, is a very serious mistake. I think this actually is the biggest culprit because it walks right into the move e6. It walks right into that. White had to keep the queen here so that the queen aims at the d6 pawn. What would I do here with white to maintain the advantage? I would play a simple move like rook a to d1. You might say, well, why are we putting the rook on a closed file? It's to discourage black from playing e6 even further. How would we have played here? I would have played knight fd7 to get the knight around to c5. White can flick this in as a way to cramp black even further. And actually, I think white can go directly for our throat with the knight to g5. Hopefully you've seen this concept, and then just go f4 and try to go f5 and blast open the f-file. These ideas can be wildly dangerous, these knight g5, f4, f5 concepts. Something else that you should be familiar with if you have seen your fair share of Grand Prix attack games or Sicilian games, these ideas are incredibly common. But I could probably even find some King's Indian games where, let me see if I can find something where this exact type of attack happens. So here's a game from the Women's Olympiad 1996. Two strong players. Zhu Chen is a Grandmaster. So white plays bishop h6. And watch what white does. Bang, bang. White starts accumulating pieces on the king side. The queen drops back. Why does it drop back? To prepare f4, exactly like we were talking about. Black tries to do some stuff on the queen side, fails. f5, rook f1, get the rook to the open f-file. h4, keep accumulating, get the knight into the attack. And here white finds a brilliant tactic. Who can spot the way to shatter black's king position? Also pretty typical idea, by the way. Yeah, knight f7 is winning. She plays knight takes h7, same concept, different side. Bang. h5. Not even queen takes g6 because there's no actual mate. White uses the pawns to generate even stronger of a threat on g6. g5, black defends very resiliently. But in this position, white makes an incredibly sexy move. It's a retreating move. It's a retreating move. Who can spot it? And it reignites white's attack. Not bishop e5 because just d takes e5. There's not enough there. Bishop c1 is correct. Very nice. You get the bishop to the long diagonal. Your hand should be reaching to play that move. Bang. And this is over because white shatters the center and the king is so wide open. All of white's pieces are in the attack. and white just like destroys black on all sides of the board. D6. And if you play knight takes d6, I think that bishop f6 check is winning the game because there's this check and there's mate on h6. King f8, rook f6 is obvious checkmate as well. So this is all very, very bad for black. And white wins the game just by taking the rook in the corner. Queen d5, by the way, look at this move. Using the pin on the knight to fork the king and the rook, winning decisive material. I can analyze this a lot longer, and maybe white's play was not ideal, but these types of ideas should be considered very carefully. When your king side is a little bit open, don't forget the concept of like bishop h6, knight g5, and then running the f-pawn down the board to open up the f-file. Here, white is quite a bit better, so I think this is how our opponent should have played. The engine doesn't approve of knight f to d7 for that reason. According to the engine, black should just play a more docile move, like rook to c8, to keep the knight closer to the king side, to take the sting out of bishop h6, bishop h8, knight g5, which is still very dangerous, by the way. And now the other knight should be brought to d7. And after f4, you should start expanding on the queen side. The point of keeping the knight on f6 is so that if white plays f5, white is not threatening to take on g6 because the knight stands between the rook and the f7 pawn. So something like this, white is better. Queen e2 is an aimless move. Our opponent focuses on the wrong thing. It's not aimless. Opponent sees the c4 pawn, but this is not what white needs to attack. And after e6, I think the tables turn immediately and black is already much better. So d takes e6 is correct. If white would have played instead bishop takes c4, then of course we play e takes d5 and white collapses. White loses the pawn on e4 because if you count the defenders, obviously white has insufficient defenders because of that pesky rook on e8 x-raying the queen on e2. So our opponent correctly took on e6 and here makes the decisive mistake in an already very bad position. After bishop takes c4, our pieces just start breathing, and I don't think that white can realistically hope to save this position anymore. Although maybe there is some way to keep the balance with computer-like play, but from a human standpoint, I think white's position here is already indefensible. How would I have played with white in this position? I would have probably gone knight g5 to attack the rook, but mainly to solidify the e4 pawn. And after the rook moves back, I would have probably immediately brought my rook into the game and hit the d6 pawn. Black can play d5, but the position is super complicated here. Maybe get the queen out of the x-ray, and it's complete pandemonium. There might be a sack on f7 because of the x-ray. I don't know what's going on here. I think black is comfortable, but at least white gets realistic chances to muddy the waters. So in any case, our opponent decided instead to take on c4, which is a little bit impatient. We eliminate the bishop, and then we take on e4. I even think knight d4 was a good move. I think our opponent was playing very well up until the blunder, which is knight to d5. This is, of course, the decisive blunder because it loses a minor piece, and it puts the minor pieces in harm's way. How would I have played here with white? I have no idea. I think white's position is incredibly, incredibly dire. I was briefly worried about the look of knight c6 because it slices off the connection between the bishop and the knight. And the last thing that we want to do as black is to give up one of our bishops. If we give up one of our bishops, the intensity of our initiative is greatly diminished. And this position just looks like a draw to me because white's going to win d6, black's going to win c3. This is not how we do it. Who can tell me a better and more patient move after knight to c6? Using tactics to defend the knight on e4 indirectly. Not rook c8, folks. You're missing some of the same stuff. So this is a really good teaching moment because the way you're thinking about it is like, oh, white takes our queen, we take white's queen. But you have to calculate one move further. You have to make sure that in the resulting position, nothing is hanging. Here, this is hanging. And what's funny is that after knight takes c3, opening up an attack on the bishop, white has this move, forking the two rooks. White's going to emerge up an exchange. So instead, I think there's two ways to play here. Queen to f6 is one way, or even queen to h4, intending knight e4, queen f4, and look at how everything is hanging here. But even simpler is just to move the queen up to d7, counterattacking the knight. And this position looks fantastic for black. We keep our bishop pair, we attack the knight, we attack the pawn. Our d-pawn could start running up the board, and white is just getting destroyed here. White is just getting destroyed here. So queen d7 is very simple and very strong. Yeah, queen h4 is the more adventurous move. Queen d7 is the Russian schoolboy type of move. Or actually, no, scratch that. I blundered. I forgot that white can take on d6. Sorry, that was my bad. White can actually... Even this, I think, is unclear. Okay, so I amend my statement. I actually think... Okay, the engine gives a ridiculous idea here, which is to play here and then to play an intermezzo that preserves the d6 pawn. Does anybody see this intermediate move? I guess now that I set it up, it becomes easy, but it's a really pretty move. d5. Yeah, d5. Deflection. You force the queen onto d5, and now you play bishop c6, skewering the queen to the knight. But unfortunately, white has queen to c5, which saves the knight. But still, you trade queens, you take b2, and black is obviously much better in the endgame because you have the bishop pair and much more active pieces. Wow, Jesus. So lots of tactical subtleties here to explore. Anyways, I think knight c6 would have been a better practical chance. It's the top engine move. Knight e4, rook e4 makes matters worse. Maybe white could have held it like this. But here we just accumulate the pressure with queen e7. This threatens rook takes bishop, by the way, because white will lose the knight at the end. And this is in a very unenviable type of position. This is why you don't want to look at an engine eval here and say, oh, it's 0.4. Black is slightly better. No, right? From a human perspective, black is not slightly better. If you look at this with your own eyes, you should understand how bad this is for white, a situation like this. So obviously after knight d5, the game ends. We play rook c8. And by the way, there is a second way that we can win a minor piece. We did it in a very straightforward way. Also good is knight e4 to c5, because this defends the bishop, attacks the queen, and I don't see a good square for the queen. If it goes back to c4, we drop the knight back to e6, knight e6 fe, and white cannot save both of these pieces at the same time. Yeah, so knight e6 isn't. Two retreating knight moves, by the way, knight c5 and knight e6. White doesn't have anywhere else to go. If he goes back, then we snap off this knight. Yeah, queen c4, knight e6. Knight e6. Now, don't take the queen. Again, don't just automatically take a piece because white is more or less alive after knight takes d. It's still probably losing. But f takes c6 is much simpler. Can the knight cover the attack? No, because we have two defenders on that square. And the game ended after... Okay, our opponent blundered the queen, but obviously it didn't matter because the queen has no way to move back and defend the knight at the same time. And knight c6, here we do take the queen because at the end we just win the knight. Phew. That was an extensive analysis session. I know that was a lot, and it might have been overwhelming at certain points, but hopefully it teaches you a little bit about the sort of King's Indian setup that we played. The main takeaway from the opening is that you need to be flexible. If you want to be a real opening expert, you need to amend your opening approach based on what your opponent does. Even if you're a Grunfeld player, it doesn't mean that you blindly play the same setup in every single game. You have to be able to make small changes, such as, okay, here, a very good approach would have been to play a Benko-style opening. We decided to play a King's Indian-style setup, and you shouldn't be that scared of playing something a little bit new, because if you follow common sense, you can generally go a pretty long way. And if your opponent is playing something offbeat, then they are generally not too familiar with openings either, and you should be fine. And again, this will be on YouTube, so you can watch it more slowly and follow some of the lines on a board, for example. Any question?